It began, as many storms do, not with thunder, but with silence. In the final decades of the 19th century and the trembling dawn of the 20th, Europe stood like a cathedral at twilight, its stained glass aglow with fading certainties, its stone columns, faith, empire, tradition, beginning to crack beneath the weight of unseen tremors. The Church, eternal Rome, sat at the center of this slow collapse. But even within those hallowed walls, the old order sensed it would not survive untouched. The Vatican had weathered centuries of upheaval, schism, secularism, revolution. But what loomed now was different. The air trembled with ideologies not just political, but apocalyptic. Darwin had redefined creation. Marx had redefined justice. Nietzsche had declared God dead. And in the distance, darker forces gathered. Monarchies fell. Empires split. Trenches dug. The Great War consumed millions. And when it ended, the silence it left behind was not peace, but disillusionment. In that silence, men in black uniforms, men with flags and iron, began to speak. So did the Vatican listen, or did it wait? In those years, between world wars, amidst collapsing kingdoms and rising dictatorships, the Church found itself trapped between memory and survival. It could no longer command empires, but neither could it disappear. So it turned to something older than faith: diplomacy. But faith and diplomacy do not share a bed easily. What emerged over the next 3 decades would become one of the most enigmatic and controversial legacies of the Catholic Church, a series of unholy agreements with unholy men. Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, dictators whose rise would be blessed, not always with words, but with silence. Their regimes would be met not with the thunder of anathema, but with the quiet turning of pages, the soft scratching of pens on parchment behind closed doors. And in those margins, history was rewritten. Not erased, but altered. Not lied about, but forgotten. This is not a story of evil clergy or conspiracies drawn in smoke. It is something more human, and therefore more dangerous. It is a story of fear, of trade, of compromise. It is the story of how the Church, keeper of the Gospels, defender of the poor, shepherd of souls, chose, in the darkest hour of the modern age, to negotiate with monsters. But to understand why, we must return to the beginning. Not to Hitler, nor Mussolini, nor Franco, but to a man in a red robe walking the halls of a palace newly reborn as a country. Pope Pius IX had, in the 19th century, seen his papal states stripped away by the rising Italian kingdom. Rome was no longer his city. By 1870, the Pope had declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican, refusing to recognize the new Italian government. For over half a century, the Vatican stood isolated, its political status ambiguous, its power wounded. The Church had lost territory, income, and relevance, and yet it remained. It endured, but the scars were deep. The trauma of disinheritance lingered. Then, in 1922, Benito Mussolini came to power, and in 1929, a miracle, or a pact, occurred, the Lateran Treaty. In exchange for recognizing the sovereignty of the Holy See and returning financial compensation, the Vatican acknowledged Mussolini's fascist regime as legitimate. For the first time in modern history, the Church became its own nation, tiny but absolute. Vatican City was born. Some called it restoration, others capitulation. But it was not the last. As the storm gathered over Europe, through fascist marches in Rome, swastikas unfurling in Berlin, and civil war erupting in Spain, the Vatican would be faced again and again with a terrible question. Should it speak, or should it survive? Each time, the answer became more complex. For dictators, a blessing from the Church meant legitimacy. For the Church, it meant protection. But what was protected? Doctrine, territory, souls? This was not the corruption of gold or indulgences. It was the corruption of caution. The Church, fearful of modernity, fearful of communism, fearful of its own fading influence, began to see these new regimes as less of a threat than the secularism they claimed to fight. And so, silence became strategy. The silence of bishops, the silence of encyclicals, the silence of saints. And beneath that silence, people vanished. Jews, dissidents, journalists, priests. The storm came, and it did not spare the holy, but the Vatican, wrapped in its walls, preserved its sovereignty, its archives, its liturgy, its secret files. Even now, not all documents from that era have been released. Historians wait. Names are redacted. Motives remain cloaked in Latin legalisms and diplomatic euphemisms. But something more dangerous than a document still lingers. A question. If the Church, in its deepest crisis, turned to power over prophecy, what does it mean to be holy? This is not an accusation. It is a requiem, a meditation, a map through shadow. In the chapters to come, we will follow the signatures on treaties that should never have existed. We will hear the silence that rang louder than condemnation. We will descend into archives, some real, some metaphorical, where truths are stored not to be destroyed, but to be forgotten. And we will ask, not just what the Church did, but what it believed it was doing. Because no one thinks themselves the villain of their own gospel, not even when they choose to shake hands with tyrants. In the shadow of the Tiber River, beneath the domes of an old world dying and the columns of a new order rising, an agreement was forged, not of divine inspiration, but of practical necessity. It was February 11th, 1929, when signatures etched onto parchment in a side room of the Lateran Palace brought an empire of faith back into territorial existence, the Lateran Treaty. At first glance, it was a diplomatic miracle. After nearly 60 years of self-imposed isolation, since the capture of Rome in 1870 had dissolved the Papal States, the Holy See was stateless, landless, symbolic. The Pope called himself a prisoner. The Church no longer held a kingdom. But now, under the leadership of Pope Pius V and Benito Mussolini, that would change. The Lateran Pact restored to the Church what it had lost: sovereignty. It birthed the microstate of Vatican City, 44 hectares of sacral autonomy. It provided financial reparations, it guaranteed religious privileges, it made Catholicism the official religion of the Kingdom of Italy. But what did Mussolini gain? Legitimacy. The fascist regime, still consolidating power, could now boast the backing of the world's most ancient spiritual institution. The handshake between Mussolini and Cardinal Gaspari, the Pope's Secretary of State, was more than ceremonial. It signaled to millions of Italian Catholics that the Church had, in essence, baptized fascism. How did such a thing come to be? The answer is tangled in fear and memory. The Vatican, still haunted by the anti-clerical fervor of the 19th century, had long feared liberal republicanism more than it feared authoritarianism. The rise of Mussolini offered a paradoxical comfort: order, stability, and, most crucially, an anti-communist stance. In a world increasingly flirting with Bolshevism, the Vatican saw the fascists not as saviors, but as a necessary evil. Mussolini, ever the opportunist, understood this. He played the part of the protector of Catholic values, despite being an atheist, a blasphemer, and a former socialist agitator. His speeches railed against decadence, immorality, and Marxism, all while consolidating state violence and dismantling democratic institutions. The Church, in return, kept its criticisms muted. There were tensions, to be sure. In the early 1930s, fascist youth groups began targeting Catholic action. The Church's youth organization, Pope Pius V, responded with encyclicals, most famously Non abbiamo bisogno, We do not need fascism, in 1931, condemning Mussolini's attempts to absorb Catholic youth into state-run fascist cults. But the rebuke was measured, private, nuanced, and the Lateran Treaty remained untouched. In the years that followed, Mussolini would extend his reach into Ethiopia, into Albania, into dreams of empire. His regime would pass racial laws echoing Nazi Germany. And yet, the Vatican, though discomfited, did not break ties. Why? Because the treaty had become a foundation stone of the modern papacy. To criticize Mussolini too harshly risked destabilizing the delicate diplomatic ecosystem the Church had rebuilt with such care. There are archives, some open, some still sealed, detailing the private letters exchanged between the Curia and the Duce's ministers. They speak in the language of diplomacy, veiled, conditional, filled with footnotes and deferrals. But beneath them lies a truth more visceral. The Church had regained its walls, and it would not risk them again. There is one document, rarely shown, stored in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, signed on February 11, 1929, Trattati Lateranensi. The paper is aged, but the ink is still firm. Beside Mussolini's signature is that of Pietro Gasparri. The space for the Pope remains unsigned, symbolically. The Vicar of Christ does not sign treaties with mortals, but history does. In this period, the Vatican cultivated what some historians have called diplomatic neutrality, a policy of non-interference, justified as spiritual independence. But neutrality, in the face of tyranny, becomes something else: complicity. There were priests who opposed Mussolini, bishops who whispered their discontent. But the machine of the Church, as an institution, moved slowly, deliberately, and, above all, safely. And Mussolini? He grew bolder. He modelled his regime on ancient Rome. He resurrected imperial pageantry, and in his court parades, sometimes, he invited bishops to watch. The ironies were bitter. Here was the heir of Nero, applauded by the successors of Peter. But the Vatican had its state, its flag, its coins and postage stamps, its Swiss guards. It had risen again, albeit smaller, and it would not be torn down so easily. Even when, by 1938, Italy passed its own racial laws, excluding Jews from public life, education, and citizenship, the Vatican protested only cautiously. Pope Pius X did commission an encyclical condemning racism, Humani Generis Unitas, the unity of the human race, but he died before it could be released. His successor, Pius X, chose not to publish it. Silence returned, the treaty held, and in the years to follow, silence would become the Church's most enduring language. Mussolini's fall would come, but not before his alliance with Hitler dragged Italy into war, and not before he sent thousands of Jews to their deaths. But by then, the Lateran Pact had outlived its architect. The fascist state had collapsed, but the Church-state agreement endured. Even the modern Italian Republic formed after World War II reaffirmed it. Such is the paradox of history. A deal made with a dictator remains canon law. A silence once deemed strategic becomes permanent. The Lateran Treaty is still in force today. There is a plaque in the Lateran Palace marking the signing. Visitors pass it often. Few stop. Fewer still wonder what it cost, because the Church survived. But what was the price of its survival? And if we bless survival over witness, what then do we believe? The year was 1933. Germany, broken by defeat, humiliated by Versailles, haunted by inflation, and starved by unemployment, stood on the edge of abyss. In that void, a voice emerged, a voice that did not whisper, but thundered, a voice of myth, of blood, of vengeance. Adolf Hitler had risen. On January 30th, 1933, he became Chancellor of Germany. By March, he had consolidated power through the Enabling Act, effectively dismantling the Weimar Republic. The Reichstag burned, and with it, democracy turned to ash. The Church watched, but not from the pulpit, from the diplomatic desk. Only months after Hitler's ascension, negotiations began between the Vatican and the Third Reich, a regime barely born, already bleeding repression, but quickly gaining the legitimacy it craved. The outcome of those negotiations would become one of the most debated documents in modern Church history. the Reichskonkordat, signed July 20th, 1933. An agreement between Pope Pius V's Holy See and Hitler's regime. An agreement which, on the surface, guaranteed the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany, its schools, its clergy, its organizations. But beneath that promise lay a dark transaction. In exchange for protections, the Vatican agreed to dissolve Catholic political activity in Germany. Most notably, the Catholic Centre Party, the last real obstacle to Hitler's total power. What the Reichskonkordat achieved for Hitler was staggering. It gave his regime, just 6 months old, moral credibility on the world stage. If the Pope shook hands with the Führer, how bad could he truly be? The Vatican's envoy was Eugenio Pacelli, then Secretary of State, later to become Pope Pius XIII. Pacelli was no fool. He had served as nuncio to Bavaria and knew German politics intimately. His decision to engage Hitler diplomatically was not naive, it was strategic. But strategy has its own sins. Pacelli saw communism as the greater threat. He believed the Church could influence Hitler from within, or at least secure the survival of the Church in Germany. He sought an institutional safeguard against chaos. But what he helped deliver was something else, a sacred seal on a profane power. Hitler signed the Concordat with ceremonial precision, even sending Franz von Papen, a Catholic aristocrat, as ambassador to the Holy See. But privately, Hitler dismissed it as a piece of paper to be torn up when convenient. In Mein Kampf, he had already declared Christianity a tool to be used and discarded. The Reichskonkordat became a shield, not for the Church, but for the regime. With it, Hitler proceeded to dismantle the remaining Catholic press, harass clergy, shut down religious schools, and arrest dissidents. Over time, thousands of Catholic priests, monks, and laypersons would be sent to concentration camps. The Church had rights on paper, but paper burns. Pius V began to regret the accord. By 1937, he issued the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern, written in German, not Latin, and smuggled into Germany to be read from Catholic pulpits. It condemned Nazi ideology, racism, and violations of the Concordat. It was a rare moment of fire, but it came too late. The regime had already solidified. The churches were intimidated. The bishops were wary. And Hitler? He ignored the encyclical completely. Pius V would die in 1939, disillusioned and heartbroken. His planned condemnation of both Nazism and anti-Semitism, Humani Generis Unitas, was left unpublished. His successor, Eugenio Pacelli, now Pius V, took the throne of Peter on the very eve of war, and he would choose a different path. The Reichskonkordat was never rescinded. It remains technically in force even today. Historians have long debated its nature. Was it a necessary evil in a dark hour? A naive trust in diplomatic order? Or something more corrosive? A willingness to accept survival over prophetic witness? Some argue the Vatican was outmaneuvered. Others say it was complicit. But what is certain is this: when the smoke cleared, and the bodies were counted, and the names were etched on stone, the Church could not say it had shouted. It had whispered, and whispers do not stop tyrants. Among the unsealed Vatican archives are notes from internal debates in 1933, transcripts of negotiations between Pacelli and German officials, notes expressing discomfort, caution, even dread. One cardinal wrote, "We are not making peace with a man. We are making peace with a myth." But the treaty was signed, and with it, the Church became, willingly or not, a witness to atrocity, bound by silence. Years later, when asked why the Vatican did not publicly denounce Hitler's crimes as they unfolded, defenders would invoke neutrality. They would say, "If we had spoken, more would have died." But others would ask, "If the Church cannot speak when God's image is being annihilated, then when will it?" This is not an accusation. It is a lament for a church caught between its fear of communism and its fear of irrelevance. A lament for souls who waited for Rome to speak and heard only prayers, not warnings. A lament for a parchment still sealed in drawers, marked sub secreto. Because beneath all this, the treaty, the silence, the regret, remains a fundamental question. Can one make peace with evil and remain unstained? The Church survived the Reich, but some would say it never fully emerged from that silence. There are moments in history when silence roars louder than speech, when the absence of words echoes across generations, louder than sermons, more lasting than laws. The papacy of Pius X, born Eugenio Pacelli, is one such moment. He ascended the papal throne on March 3, 1939, just months before Nazi Germany would march into Poland. A former diplomat, a canonist, a man of profound formality and intelligence, Pacelli entered the chair of Peter as the world teetered into its second great cataclysm. He had been instrumental in the Reichskonkordat of 1933. He knew Germany, its people, its politics. He also knew its dangers. And yet, as war broke out, as the Wehrmacht rolled across Europe, as Hitler's final solution began its machinery of death, Pius X remained silent. Not silent in his heart, not silent in his prayers, but silent where the world needed a voice. In 1942, after millions of Jews had already been deported, shot, gassed, and buried, Pius XIV delivered a Christmas message that alluded, delicately, obliquely, to the suffering of hundreds of thousands who, through no fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of nationality or race, have been consigned to death. But he did not say the word Jew. He did not say Holocaust. He did not name Germany. For some, it was a whisper of courage. For others, a betrayal. Why did he not speak louder? Clearer? Sooner? That question has haunted historians, theologians, survivors. It has birthed libraries of speculation, defense, and accusation. Some argue that Pius X worked quietly, behind the scenes, to save Jewish lives. Indeed, documents suggest the Vatican sheltered thousands in churches, convents, and monasteries. In Rome alone, over 4,000 Jews found refuge in religious houses during the Nazi occupation. There were covert instructions to nuncios, papal ambassadors, encouraging them to assist Jews, to issue baptismal certificates, to intervene discreetly. But discretion is not prophecy, and the world, watching Auschwitz burn, wondered why the Vicar of Christ did not cry out. In Germany, some Catholic bishops, like Clemens von Galen, had openly denounced Nazi euthanasia programs. In the Netherlands, a public condemnation of Nazi racial policies by the Catholic hierarchy led to swift retribution. 40,000 Jews, including hundreds of converts, were deported in retaliation. Pius X, perhaps, saw these consequences and chose caution. He feared that public statements would provoke worse violence or jeopardize neutrality. He believed the papacy should remain above the political fray, a moral compass, not a political player. But silence, too, is a political act. In 1963, the German playwright Rolf Hochhuth released The Deputy, a drama accusing Pius X of moral cowardice, of valuing diplomacy over human life. The play ignited a firestorm. Defenders of the Pope rushed to his aid, highlighting his private interventions, the Jews he helped save, the delicate balance he tried to maintain. But the questions would not die. In 2020, under Pope Francis, the Vatican finally opened its wartime archives related to Pius X. What they revealed was complex. There were letters from Jewish organizations begging for papal intervention. There were reports detailing Nazi atrocities, arriving in the Vatican months or years before the world knew. There were notes of hesitation, fear, diplomatic entanglement. One report from 1942 detailed mass executions in Ukraine, tens of thousands of Jews shot into ravines. The Vatican's response was to seek verification, but how many deaths require confirmation? Another document reveals that the Pope was informed about Auschwitz as early as 1942, with first-hand testimony of gas chambers, mass graves, crematoria. Still, no public condemnation came. There were whispers, never thunder. Defenders point out that Pius XIII was praised after the war by Jewish leaders. Golda Meir, before becoming Israel's prime minister, wrote in 1958, "When fearful martyrdom came to our people, the voice of the Pope was raised for the victims." Others say these were diplomatic courtesies, offered in the fog of post-war rebuilding. Some historians, like John Cornwell, argue that Pius V's silence was rooted in a broader theological rigidity, a view that the Church must never appear aligned with any political ideology, even in opposition to evil. Yet that same rigidity allowed for concordats, treaties, and pragmatic deals with fascists. So what is the measure of neutrality when the world is on fire? Pius V died in 1958, entombed in the grottos of St. Peter's Basilica. To this day, he has not been canonized. His cause for sainthood is stalled, not for lack of miracles, but for excess of mystery. Because in the smoke of the camps, amid the ruins of Europe, his silence became more than absence. It became a symbol, a mirror. In it, we see not only a man, not only a papacy, but a church wrestling with the unbearable tension between spiritual authority and moral risk. What is a shepherd who will not speak? What is a prophet who will not weep? What is a church that guards its walls while its flock is burned? Perhaps Pius XIV did what he believed was right. Perhaps he feared that one more voice would add only to the echo of horror. Or perhaps he believed that history one day would understand. But history does not understand silence. It records it. It interrogates it, and it does not forget. Spain, 1936. A nation already bleeding from centuries of empire, straining under the weight of poverty, revolution, and anti-clerical violence, now tore itself apart in civil war. On one side, the Republican government, leftist, secular, and increasingly aligned with communist elements. On the other, nationalist forces, led by General Franco, backed by monarchists, conservatives, and most fatefully, the Catholic Church. The Spanish Civil War was not merely a political struggle. It was a religious reckoning. Churches were burned, priests murdered, convents desecrated. Thousands of clergy were killed by Republican militias. In the eyes of many believers, Spain had become a Golgotha without mercy. For the Vatican, the war was viewed not as a domestic rebellion, but a crusade. A battle between the godless and the faithful, between Marx and Christ. As Franco's forces advanced, supported by Hitler's Luftwaffe and Mussolini's troops, the Vatican made its choice. Pope Pius V sent his blessing to Franco. Bishops in Spain proclaimed him the chosen restorer of Christian order. In homilies and encyclicals, the nationalist cause was cloaked in the language of redemption. Franco, ever the opportunist, wrapped himself in that mantle. He presented himself as the Catholic strongman, a modern-day Constantine who would defend the church with sword and fire. In return, the church elevated him beyond general, into savior. When Franco emerged victorious in 1939, his first visit was not to the people, but to the altar, and the church rejoiced. In a concordat signed in 1953 between Franco's regime and the Vatican, Spain was officially declared a Catholic confessional state. Catholicism was not just a religion, it was the ideology of the nation. Religious education became mandatory. Civil marriages were invalid. Catholic feast days became national holidays. But beneath this veneer of devotion, terror reigned. Franco's Spain was no theocracy of compassion. It was a state of informants, prisons, torture, and censorship. Political opponents were silenced, executed, or exiled. Children of dissenters were stolen and given to morally fit Catholic families. Basque and Catalan identities were crushed, all in the name of order and faith. And through it all, the church remained, not silent, but complicit. It endorsed the regime. It thrived under it. Bishops held seats in Franco's parliament. Priests served as propagandists. Seminaries flourished. Religious orders regained lost lands and wealth. Some resisted. A few priests, inspired by liberation theology or human rights, spoke out. They were punished, marginalized, reassigned. The dominant ecclesial voice, however, remained loyal. Franco was referred to in liturgical prayers as caudillo por la gracia de Dios, leader by the grace of God. Even at his funeral in 1975, bishops wept, praising him as a guardian of faith. The Spanish church had gained much, but it had lost something greater. It had lost its moral independence, its prophetic edge, its ability to stand with the crucified rather than with the powerful. In the decades that followed, as Spain democratized, a deep reckoning began. Generations of Catholics, especially the young, turned away, disillusioned. Churches emptied. Faith became suspect, tainted by the memory of a regime wrapped in cassocks and silence. Even today, Franco's legacy divides Spain. His mausoleum, once a site of national veneration, has become a symbol of unresolved wounds. In 2019, his remains were exhumed and relocated by government order. The Church offered no resistance, but neither did it lead the call. And the Vatican? It remained polite. The Concordat of 1953 was never fully repudiated, merely modified. There are documents in the Spanish Episcopal Archive, letters between bishops and the Vatican during the war, some pleading for support, others urging restraint. But above all, they reflect a posture of survival through alliance. To the Church, Franco offered something the Republic never could: protection. But at what cost? What does it mean when the cross is hoisted beside the gallows? When sacraments are administered by soldiers? When hymns drown out the cries of the disappeared? These are not rhetorical questions. They are open wounds. In monasteries across Spain, some nuns and monks now keep silent vigils, lighting candles for victims of both sides. In some churches, prayers are offered not for Franco, but for those whose names were never spoken in his time. This, perhaps, is the slow return of conscience, but the institution remains marked. The Spanish Church, once triumphant, now walks with a limp, and the Vatican, once again, stands in the uneasy shadow of history, blessed by survival, burdened by compromise. Franco is gone, his statues fall. But the silence, once sanctified, still echoes in the spaces between organ notes, still lives in the margins of baptismal books, still haunts the quiet confessionals of those who remember, and still wait to be heard. History, when viewed from a distance, appears clean, divided into good and evil, heroes and villains, saints and sinners. But up close, through the fog of crisis, fear, and the desperate desire to preserve what is sacred, it becomes something else, a moral labyrinth. This is where the Church found itself, not once, but again and again, throughout the 20th century, caught between its divine mission and its institutional survival. In theory, the Church exists outside of time. It is the bride of Christ, eternal, unshaken by empire or ideology. In practice, however, the Church is also a structure of laws, officials, properties, and influence, and structures fear collapse. As fascist regimes rose in Italy, Germany, and Spain, they offered the Vatican an unspoken deal: protection for silence, respect for sovereignty in exchange for spiritual endorsement, or at least spiritual neutrality. The question is not whether the Church compromised. It did. The question is why. To understand, we must return to the very foundations of Catholic fear, the rise of communism. To the Vatican, Bolshevism represented not just a political threat, but an existential one. Where fascists marched with crosses, communists burned them. Where fascists co-opted the clergy, communists exiled or executed them. The Russian Revolution had shown what a godless revolution could do to religion. In that context, Hitler was not an ally, but a firewall, a dangerous one. But perhaps a necessary one. This was the logic expressed in diplomatic communiques, in curial memoranda, in private papal briefings. We do not support fascism, we merely oppose its enemies. But accommodation is not passive. To strike a deal with power is to be shaped by it. In seeking to preserve schools, sacraments, and sovereignty, the Church accepted parameters, moral boundaries set not by the gospel, but by the state. It gave away its voice, then wondered why the people no longer heard it. This is where ethics meet shadow. What is the value of a school preserved if it teaches in silence while atrocities unfold outside its walls? What is the meaning of neutrality when neutrality itself becomes complicity? In the post-war era, Vatican officials often defended their decisions with a single phrase. We acted prudently, and perhaps they did, but prudence is not prophecy. Prophets do not survive comfortably. They are chased, mocked, martyred. Their virtue lies not in caution, but in confrontation. The Church, however, chose to survive. It outlived Mussolini, outlived Hitler, outlived Franco. But at what cost? There is a scene, often cited by scholars, from the Nuremberg trials. A Nazi officer is asked how the regime was able to act with such impunity. He answers, "Because the Pope said nothing." Whether this was true or a cynical deflection is beside the point. The perception mattered. Because silence from the moral authority of the Catholic Church was not just absence, it was presence. It was interpreted by regimes, by victims, by history as assent. In private letters uncovered in the archives of the German resistance, there are pleas for papal intervention, not political, but spiritual. One Catholic lawyer, imprisoned for hiding Jews, wrote, "If the Holy Father speaks even once and clearly, the world will tremble." He died in Dachau. The plea was never answered. But the ethical complexity does not vanish with outrage. Vatican defenders point to the risk of retaliation. They cite the massacre of Dutch Jews after the bishops there protested publicly. They argue that quiet diplomacy saved more lives than public condemnation would have, and they are not wrong. But perhaps that is the tragedy, that the Church, in the face of mechanized evil, could only choose between flawed paths, speak and risk lives, or remain silent and risk its soul. Is that prudence or paralysis? We will never fully know what might have happened had the Church stood against fascism with thunder rather than whispers. But we know what did happen. Children went to gas chambers baptized. Priests blessed troops who executed civilians. Bishops gave benedictions to dictators who silenced millions. And the Church endured. But endurance is not justification. It is only testimony. In Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, new generations of theologians have begun to reinterpret this history, not to condemn, but to learn. They ask, what is the role of the Church in times of systemic evil? Is neutrality even possible? Is silence ever holy? Liberation theology, born in the slums and resistance movements of the Global South, arose as a response. It proclaimed that Christ stands with the oppressed, not above history, but within it. That to remain above the fray is to abandon the cross itself. And yet, those voices too were once silenced, declared dangerous, Marxist, unorthodox. It is a recurring pattern. When the Church seeks comfort, it retreats. When it seeks truth, it bleeds. And so, the question remains, can an institution rooted in eternity navigate temporal power without being consumed by it? There are no easy answers, only archives, only tombs, only names carved in silence. But perhaps the lesson is not about judgment, but memory. That to remember these concordats, these pacts of survival, is not to condemn the men who signed them, but to refuse their repetition. Because every age has its tyrants, and every tyrant seeks a priest. The Church, now more than ever, must choose to be a guardian of survival, or to be a witness of truth, even unto death. Deep beneath the marble floors of the Apostolic Palace lies a world few have seen. Vaulted corridors, locked iron doors, parchment bound in ribbon and dust. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, once known as the Secret Archive, is not a place of fantasy, but of memory, curated, classified, and until recently, closed. For decades, historians, scholars, and journalists knocked on those doors with questions. Most went unanswered, until March 2020. It was then that Pope Francis, in an unprecedented move, authorized the opening of archives related to the papacy of Pius V, covering the years of the Second World War. What emerged did not destroy the Church, nor exonerate it. It did something harder. It revealed a mirror. Inside were pleas from Jewish leaders, letters from bishops begging for guidance, reports from nuncios describing deportations, executions, book burnings, and ghettos. There were summaries of meetings with Nazi ambassadors, transcripts of internal debates. Some documents were marked sub secreto, to be seen only by the Pope and his closest advisors. Others bore notations like, "Hold for now," "Not suitable for publication," "Too sensitive." One chilling report, dated 1942, describes the roundup of Jews in Slovakia. The Vatican's response: "We are concerned. We will follow developments." But no public statement was issued. No letter to the faithful. No condemnation. There were moments of light. Notes about nuns hiding children. Monks falsifying records. Bishops risking prison to shelter refugees. A letter from a German abbot warning Rome of mass extermination. A memo detailing a secret shelter network under churches in Hungary and Italy. But what remains most haunting is what's not in the archive. The words never said, the homilies never delivered, the silences that were planned, not spontaneous. This is not just a bureaucratic record, it is an anatomy of conscience. Even now, only part of the Vatican's historical holdings have been opened. There are boxes still sealed, files still redacted, names still hidden. Not to protect the guilty, perhaps, but to preserve the image. Because image matters. The Church, since its birth, has been both sacrament and sign. Its authority is not only spiritual, it is symbolic, and symbols must be unblemished. But history does not care for perfection, it cares for truth, and truth, especially when whispered, demands listening. Across Europe, memory is resurfacing. In museums, convents, and forgotten cemeteries, the names of those betrayed by silence are being recovered. Memorial stones, hidden journals, baptismal books with erased identities, liturgical calendars that aligned feast days with purges. Even in Rome, some young seminarians now visit Fosse Ardeatine, the site where 335 Italians, including priests and Jews, were executed by the Nazis. There, in the silence, they read aloud the names. It is not protest. It is liturgy. In Germany, a small chapel in Munich bears the names of Catholic resistors. Some were executed, others excommunicated. Their stories too were buried for decades, but silence, like a seed, can grow into memory. And memory becomes reckoning. The Vatican today faces a new question, not about Hitler, Mussolini, or Franco, but about transparency. About what it means to repent not for what was done, but for what was not done. Pope Francis has spoken, cautiously, about the need to purify memory. He has met with survivors, opened archives, and admitted failures. But the institution remains cautious. There is no public monument in St. Peter's Square to the victims of the Church's silence, no encyclical of contrition, no solemn day of mourning for the concordats that helped sustain tyranny. Some say it is too late, others say it has barely begun. But the question remains, can a church that claims to follow a crucified God ever afford to be neutral in the face of evil? And deeper still, is neutrality ever neutral? There are legends, unconfirmed but persistent, of a room beneath the Vatican Library called Stanza Retenta, the retained room, a chamber of sealed volumes too dangerous, too delicate, too compromising to open. No photos, no index, no key. Is it real or a myth? Perhaps it doesn't matter. Because the real retained room is not in stone. It is in the collective forgetting. The cultural amnesia that allows devotion to ignore history. that allows incense to smother the smell of smoke from burning books, that allows robes to flutter past prisons without stopping. But memory is stubborn, and the names are returning. Junia, Theodora, Marguerite, Hildegard, Phoebe, Clara. And now, those never named. Men, women, Jews, priests, agnostics, children, not saints, just people. Waiting not for canonization, but for recognition. Because the church does not lose its soul by erring, it loses its soul by forgetting. And so, we end not with certainty, but with questions. What if the church had shouted? What if the Pope had spoken the names? What if survival had not been the highest virtue? And the question beneath them all, what will we choose next time? Because there will be a next time. The tyrants will return. Their names will change. Their flags will look different, but their methods will not. And when they knock at the doors of the sanctuary, asking for silence in exchange for peace, will the church open the gates again? Or will it, at last, remember? Because memory is holy, and silence sometimes is the loudest sin of all.